Hello everyone. So we just finished talking about Chapter 4, which was all about consciousness, and now we're going to begin Chapter 5, which is all about learning, which is going to look into how we learn, what is learning, and then all of the different ways in which our brains help us to learn, because it's not just one way. But for the sake of today's module, which is Module 5.1, we're going to be talking about one way of learning known as classical conditioning. But before we can even get into that, we need to talk about what is learning. And for the sake of this class, when we say that someone is learning something, we mean that it's a relatively permanent change in behavior, so the way that you're behaving has now changed in some way, shape, or form that is acquired through experience. So you've had some sort of experience, whether it's through listening to someone talking, like what you are hopefully doing right now, whether it's through, you choose some sort of action and there's some sort of a good or bad outcome, whether it's through just observing others. But because of all of those experiences, we then decide, ooh, maybe I should do this differently. Or we start behaving differently without even realizing that we're doing it. And we would say that what that person is doing is learning. So again, for the sake of this class, learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior. Because again, psychology, it's all about the mind and behavior, so relatively permanent. I should also quickly say the reason why we say relatively permanent is like sometimes we'll change, and maybe for the first few days our actions are different, so we have learned. But sometimes, old habits die hard and we go back to it. So you've still learned, but that doesn't necessarily mean that your behavior has changed for good. And then it's through some sort of experience. Again, any sort. It could even just be observing someone else. That's still an experience. But one of the ways that I said that we learned was just through things that happen. I also said that sometimes we change, we learn without even realizing it. And this is what we know as classical conditioning. This is learning through an association. And for the most part, we don't even realize that it's happening. Little background information about this. There was a person known as Ivan Pavlov, or Ivan Pavlov, it depends on who your psych teacher was. I say Ivan Pavlov. And he wasn't even a psychologist. He was not interested in psychology. What he was interested in was digestion. And so he had dogs hooked up to a machine, and I will come back to this slide, but he had dogs hooked up to a machine like this. And so he would have the food for the dog, and then he had an apparatus that was connected to the dog that would collect the amount of saliva that the dog was secreting. And so he was interested, in the amount of saliva, what's happening when a dog's eating. And so every single day, when they were doing this experiment, the dog would be on this apparatus, and then a researcher would walk down the hallway with the food to bring it to the dog. And day after day this went, the dog was strapped to the machine, and then one of the researchers would walk down the hallway with the dog food. Ivan Pavlov realized that when he was in the room, just watching the dog, waiting for the food to be brought, that just the researcher walking down the hallway, the sound of the feet walking in the hallway, was causing the dog to start to drool more. But the dog didn't eat anything. The dog couldn't have smelled the food yet. It was just an association that, the researcher's walking down the hallway, this means that food is coming. And so he came up with, and I'm going to hopefully do this in the right way, the idea of classical conditioning. It's a form of learning where you are pairing something you naturally respond to, such as salivating to food, with something unnatural or unlearned, something you did not learn to respond to, such as, the sound of someone's foot going down the hallway. So this is what we call classical conditioning. It's a form of associative learning, so learning through an association between two things, by which we learn to respond to a particular stimulus. Again, stimulus is just a fancy way of saying a thing that can happen to us. So a particular stimulus in the same or similar way we respond to another stimulus. So it's pairing, excuse me, pairing those two stimuluses. And again, usually what will happen is that first stimulus is something we respond to anyway, so it's a natural response then paired with something new. This is a concept that takes a while to learn, so you're going to see that I'm going to go into big detail about it. There will be some activities that we're going to be doing. because this is often confused with the next form of learning. But the thing to remember for classical conditioning is it's learning through association. It's happening at the same time as another stimulus, and you're forming that association, that pairing between two things. So I've already talked about this. And so what was happening is before any conditioning happened, there was the sound of a bell. And I got a little ahead of myself. When Ivan Pavlov, or Pavlov, started to realize, that there was this weird pairing, he kind of switched up his research and went into, what became classical conditioning. So what he did is instead of, a person walking down the hallway with food, he instead would ring a bell. I believe in the very initial part of the study, it was technically a metronome. But again, some sort of sound for the sake of this class. And so whenever we talk about conditioning, I want you to think of the word learning. So when you're being conditioned, you're being taught in some sort of way. So this is before any learning had to happen. The dog didn't need to learn anything. And so before any learning happened, before any conditioning, there was the sound of a bell, which is the neutral stimulus, because it's neutral. The reason why we say it's neutral is because it brings about no response. So a neutral stimulus, no response. This is before any learning has happened. Then what would happen during the conditioning is there would be the ring of the bell, also with the presentation of food, and then the dog, responding in a sense to the food, would start to drool. So what's happening is the neutral stimulus, again, is bringing no response. The dog still hasn't learned, he hasn't been conditioned to associate the bell with food. But the bell is happening every single time the dog is being presented with food. And the dog will naturally respond to the food. The food, by the way, is known as the unconditioned stimulus. It is the unlearned, the unassociated thing that happens to you that brings about a response, an unlearned response. So unconditioned stimulus always brings out the unconditioned response. The dog never had to be taught to salivate with the presence of food. If you think about this, if you ever start thinking about like a juicy steak or, really good, for vegetarians, a really good salad, I don't know. And just thinking about that food kind of makes you salivate a bit. Like that's a natural human response. It's a natural response for a lot of things. And so it's unlearned. It is unconditioned. But what's happening is over and over again, the dog has the bell ringing paired with the food. And so over and over and over again, it's being paired, it's being associated that, there's this ring of the bell, there's this food, and the dog salivates. And so then afterwards, there's the ring of the bell, no presentation of food, but the dog still salivates. This is when conditioning has happened. This is when learning has happened. The association has happened. And you'll see that the neutral stimulus has now become the conditioned stimulus. And the reason why it's the conditioned stimulus is now the dog has learned to respond to the bell and bell only. He has learned, he has made that pairing, that association of, ooh, here's that bell, that means food, so I'm going to salivate. So again, classical conditioning is all about that association between what used to be a neutral stimulus being paired with something. So after repetitive times, now you just need that conditioned stimulus, and it brings out what we now call the conditioned response. Another thing to make note of, because we will try to mess you up in the exam on this, the conditioned stimulus is always the same thing as the neutral stimulus. And the conditioned response, well, it's always the same as the unconditioned response. Well, not always, I shouldn't say that. But it's usually very similar, if not identical, to the unconditioned response. So again, in this case it was the same, it was salivating. When it was unconditioned, unlearned, it was salivating to the food, because the dog didn't need to learn that. But when it's the dog salivating to the conditioned stimulus, it then becomes the conditioned response. Another way to view this is here. So again, you have the unconditioned stimulus, this is before any teaching has happened, and it brings about the unconditioned response. So unconditioned stimulus is food. How do we respond to food? We salivate. And then you have the neutral stimulus, which was that tone, it was the ring of the bell, and it brought about no salivation. But then, during conditioning, during learning, they are pairing that neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus over and over and over again, and it brings about the unconditioned response, because again, it has that food, so responding to the food, but pairing it with the tone or the bell. So then finally what happens is all you have to do is ring a bell and the dog will salivate without that unconditioned stimulus. Now some other things can happen. So let's say, that we're ringing the bell, and the dog has learned that now that bell means, ooh, food. And so that dog hears the bell and they salivate. I should also say that with classical conditioning, it's involuntary. Like a dog isn't going to think, ooh, this means food, I should start salivating now. No, salivating is a natural response. Again, usually it's for an unconditioned stimulus, but after learning, it'll happen naturally. And so let's say we're pairing it, and then, we get rid of the food. So we're just ringing the bell and ringing the bell and ringing the bell, and initially, the dog is salivating a lot when it's just the bell, but over time, you see that the response gets less and less. There's less and less saliva production. This is what we call extinction. This is the whole idea that eventually what happens is, again, in a sense, the dog learns again, like, oh, this is just a bell. It doesn't mean I'm going to get food. And so now that connection, that pairing, that association is broken, and the dog no longer salivates. So that's what we mean by extinction, which is something that you will need to know. Another thing is known as, this is on here, the condition, stimulus, suddenly elicits, an extinguished condition response when it's presented again after a period of time. This is spontaneous recovery. There it is. So in spontaneous recovery, let's say, again, you've been ringing the bell, now the dog's no longer salivating to it. And so finally, just on a random day, let's say that you've gone back to doing your research of just feeding the dog food and, seeing the saliva. Let's say that someone has a ringtone on their phone that sounds like a bell, and while they're in there, researching the dog, it goes off. All of a sudden, the dog starts salivating again. This is spontaneous recovery, and it happens sometimes. One example that I like to give for classical conditioning is a school bell. It is a sound that almost everybody out there starts to associate with, ooh, it's the end of class, or oh, it's the beginning of class, I need to make sure to be here on time. And so when we hear that bell go off, we know, oh, it's time to start packing up, it's time to, get ready to go. And so over and over and over again, we hear that noise, we hear that bell go off, and we know, oh, okay, time to put everything together, it's the end of class. Now let's say that you've graduated school, you've graduated college, all of that, you have your degree, you have a job, and that job just happens to have an emergency, noise that goes off that sounds a lot like your old school bell. But it means, the person in charge of who knows what has to put something in a machine or whatever. It doesn't mean an actual emergency. It's something that you naturally wouldn't respond to. That's not your job. And so you hear that bell over and over again, and let's say the first few times when you hear that, you're like, oh, is class over? And then you realize, oh, wait, no, I'm at my job. There is no school anymore. Yay. And then, eventually you get used to it, you kind of tune it out, because again, that's not your job, it's not your problem. But then randomly, like months later, you're just doing your job, and then all of a sudden you hear that bell again, you're like, oh God, school. That would be spontaneous recovery. Alright. There's also something known as stimulus generalization and stimulus discrimination. So generalization, when you are generalizing, it means that kind of things that are similar to a stimulus can still bring out a response. So again, the example I'm going to give for this one is, let's say that, you're walking in the streets, minding your own business, and all of a sudden this large black dog comes up to you, and, it looks really fierce and comes up and it bites you, and you're like, ah, and you freak out and you run. This brings about a fear, a conditioned response. You now have a fear of dogs, because you've now associated pain, which of course you respond to with fear and displeasure and all of that. You now associate that with dogs, because now there's that pairing, that's association. Ooh, I see a dog, that dog's going to hurt me. Hurting me is not fun. So let's say that again, like many, many years later, you're walking down the street and you see this teeny little poodle, and you go, ah, poodle, it's going to hurt me. And you freak out and you run. That would be stimulus generalization. So even if it's a small dog, even if it's not the same color, you still respond to it because it's similar to that stimulus. That's generalization. Discrimination, on the other hand, would mean that you only respond to that specific stimulus. So again, let's say, you're walking down and then you see a little wiener dog. I know it has a different name. Dachshund? I'm not good with dogs. As you've seen, I have cats. So let's say that, you see this little wiener dog, and you're like, oh, wiener dog, that's not going to hurt me. That is stimulus discrimination. You have a fear of dogs, but it's a very specific one. It has to be that large black dog to bring about that fear. You have learned to associate that fear response to that very specific stimulus, instead of generalizing it to anything, that looks like a dog. Alright, so that was classical conditioning. And as a quick overview, classical conditioning is learning through an association. It's learning through a pairing of something you naturally respond to, an unconditioned stimulus, to something that you have to learn, that association. So a conditioned stimulus. And again, whenever you hear that word conditioned, I want you to think learned, or I want you to think paired. And then there's all sorts of things that can happen, so like extinction, where after a while when you just have that conditioned stimulus, eventually you're not going to respond to it. That behavior has extincted. There's also spontaneous recovery, where all of a sudden after a long time of not responding to it, you hear that stimulus and it all comes flooding back. And then generalization and discrimination, Stimulus generalization, meaning that anything that looks like that stimulus, or is like that stimulus, or sounds like that stimulus, you generalize that association, and it brings out that response, whereas discrimination means it's only that very specific stimulus that then brings out that response. Other things, there's that bell again, maybe you responded to it. Another thing to remember is that there was someone known as Rescorla, and they demonstrated a critical element to classical conditioning that essentially says that the strength of that response to that stimulus is associated with just how good that pairing is, essentially, and how consistent it is. So the more reliable the conditioned stimulus predicts the occurrence of the unconditioned stimulus, the stronger the conditioned response is likely to be. So again, if there's a bell and only every once in a while there's food, it's going to take a lot longer for the dog to learn. The response isn't going to be that strong. But if every single time that dog hears that bell, they're presented with the food every single time, it's going to bring about a much bigger response. So that's what we mean by Rescorla's critical element to it. You have to pair it really, really strongly to one another, or else it's not going to be learned as well. There's going to be a video linked to this, and I'll also put it in the description down below. But classical conditioning is also one of the ways that we describe fear. And so there was someone known as John B. Watson. We talked about him way back in chapter 1. And he was a behaviorist that believed that the reason why we are fearful of things, the reason that we have fear, is through a classical conditioning. And so we pair some sort of unpleasant thing that happens naturally with something else. And he wanted to prove it, and so he did an experiment known as the Little Albert experiment. Again, that will be in the description, and you get to see actual footage of it. And what happened is he wanted to condition a little baby, known as Baby Albert, or Little Albert, wanted to condition him to be scared of white mice, or white rats. And so what he did initially is he had the baby there, and behind the baby, you can't quite see it in here, but behind the baby, there's this kind of big metal thing that he could hit, and made a really loud noise. And as a baby, how do you think a baby would respond to a really loud noise happening behind them where they can't see it? They'd freak out. So little Albert did, and he would cry, and he would get upset. And so that was, again, it was an unconditioned response, an unlearned response to an unconditioned stimulus. You didn't have to learn to be frightened and scared when you hear a loud noise. So then what Watson did is he would present the baby with various, objects like a white rat, a white dog, a white bunny toy, stuff like that, actually a white bunny as well, and wanted to see how he responded to it. So here's little Albert, and it's kind of hard to see, but there's a rat. And initially, little Albert could care less. Like sometimes he wouldn't even realize that there was a rat in his lap, and he would just be trying to crawl away. So then, what Watson did is he did the same thing, with a white rat, and every single time little Albert interacted with that white rat, every time it was presented to him, they made that loud noise behind him. And then little Albert would freak out. And over and over and over again, and I will say the study can no longer be replicated, but over and over and over again, little Albert was presented with this white rat, and then also presented with that loud noise, and little Albert would freak out. And so by the end of it, all they had to do was show little Albert that white rat, and he would start freaking out and crying, which is very different from how he responded the first time, where he could care less. He had now learned to fear white rats. He had developed a fear or a phobia. And it was found that he had generalized it too. So it was a stimulus generalization, because when he was shown the dog, when he was shown the bunny, anything like that, even a mask, you'll see Watson put on kind of this weird bunny mask, little Albert would freak out. And so it showed that a fear could be learned through classical conditioning. I should say that little Albert did not have this fear of white mice like forever. Extinction did happen. But also on kind of a sad note, unfortunately, little Albert did die at a young age of, I believe it was 3, from an illness, unrelated to the study though. But that's just an example that classical conditioning, not only do we learn things through pairing, we can also learn fears, again, through that pairing and association with a natural response or natural stimulus. Another thing, because I've been talking about a lot of negative things, there's also positive emotions that we can be classically conditioned to. So I'm sure that a lot of you out there, when you're in a really good mood, or, I'll say on the other side, when you're in a really bad mood, there's like this song that really speaks to you. And so, when you get really angry, you turn on the song, you blast the music, and you're really getting into it. And then when you're in a really good mood, there's like this one song that just brings it out of you and makes you feel really good. That's classical conditioning. Chances are what happened is you were in a really good mood or a really bad mood because of something that happened, or just how you were feeling, and you, without knowing it, associated it with some song that you were listening to. So now you've paired, excuse me, you've paired that song with that feeling. And this is something that is sometimes done in things like aromatherapy and music therapy, where you start to associate certain songs with certain emotions, so then when you're really in a really bad mood, there can be a certain smell or a certain song that you listen to that can help bring you out of that bad mood. But again, that's all classical conditioning. There's also one last thing known as a taste aversion. These are very, very strong. A lot of times it only takes one bad experience and it can affect you for the rest of your life. And this is classical conditioning paired with taste, and a negative, or I should say a not very nice association with the taste, so a bad taste. You'll see why I am reluctant to say negative when we talk about the next form of learning. So a bad taste associated with something. What a taste aversion is let's say that you're eating a sandwich, and unbeknownst to you, that sandwich, the mayonnaise in it, has gotten a little off. It's been sitting out too long. And so you eat that sandwich, and then all of a sudden you feel really bad and you get really sick. You're throwing up all night. It's coming out every orifice, every front, back, paint in the walls. And so from then on out, every time someone even just mentions that type of sandwich, you're like, oh no, I can't, I don't like that one. A lot of people, this is why they have certain foods they don't like. It's because they had one bad experience, and that's all it took. So that's a taste aversion. And they've actually used this for shepherds. Well, they found that they've had a wolf problem, and these wolves are attacking their sheep. And sometimes you can't, because of various reservations, things like that. You can't just kill the wolves. And so instead, what they will do is they'll take a sheep that that's already dead. Maybe something happened to it, and they'll lace the meat with something that won't make the wolves hurt, but it'll make them sick. It'll make them not feel good, like it's a really bitter taste or something like that. And it's been found that if those wolves then go and eat that sheep, they'll leave sheep alone. They're like, ugh, when I had that one sheep, it made me feel really bad, I'm not going after sheep anymore. You can also do this with pets. So let's say that, I'll say, where was she? Lucy, my one cat, has a very, very bad habit of eating plastic bags. And that can be very dangerous for her, because if she actually ingests it, it can get, tangled up in her intestines. It can cause a lot of problems. And so, what I've ended up doing is just not having plastic bags. It's also better for the environment. But another thing that I could have done, and it's another thing that's actually out there, is you can get this spray that's not bad for cats, but it tastes really bitter, and they don't like the taste of it. And so if you take that and you put that on plastic bags, what could have happened is Lucy could have, been nibbling on that bag and be like, "Ooh, this tastes really bad," and never want to nibble on it again. That's a taste aversion, and it's classical conditioning. Again, it's pairing that negative experience or that bad experience with something that you've eaten. Even though sometimes, like with that sandwich, yeah, it was bad mayonnaise, but that doesn't mean that every single sandwich that you have is going to be bad. But a lot of times, it just puts people off. And that's taste aversion. And so that's it for Module 5.1. We'll be coming back to then talk about operant conditioning, which is very similar in how it sounds, but very different in how it's applied. Where instead of learning through association, it's learning through consequences.